All right, so please join me in welcoming our fifth seminar presenter, Dr. Andrea Buchholz, something like that. Sorry. As today's seminar speaker, Dr. Buchholz Andrea is a postdoc here at the Marine Institute for Dr. Tyler Eddy. She's currently studying ecosystem responses within the North Water Polynya to fishing and climate change. Andrea graduated with her PhD at Dalhousie University and her master's at Lund University in Sweden under the supervision of the legendary Dr. Boris Worm, so fancy. Dr. Buchholz's main research interest is in the understanding of how ecosystems respond to climate change and how fisheries management and conservation can prepare for those changes. So thank you for presenting in person today, and we really appreciate it. Yeah, I'll let you take over for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I don't know if I need this. Well, yeah, I'm happy to be here in person as well. This is my first in-person talk for probably more than 2 years. So it's nice to see faces, or half of faces. Yeah, so today I will talk about my recent work. I finished a lot of that in my PhD. Some of it is still in progress, and then I will also talk a bit about my plans here while I'm a postdoc. 1 second. Okay, so more specifically, well, I'm going to talk about my highlights from global to local scales. Starting off with, because this is like the backbone of all my work so far, what is ensemble modeling, and then what is the Fish-MIP framework? You've probably heard of that by now, also yesterday, but I'm going to talk about it in my own way. Then I will go into the global changes. So what are the marine ecosystem responses to 21st century climate change? Move a bit more regional, looking into ocean basins, and then go a bit closer to home into local changes. So what are the impacts of climate change on the ecosystems, and then talk a bit about the management implications in terms of fisheries management, but also marine conservation efforts in Canada, but also more like Northwest Atlantic or the Maritimes. And then I will end off with just talk a bit about what my plans are here, where I'm looking into the changing North Water ecosystem. Okay. So let's start off with climate impacts from global to local scales. It's reacting a bit slowly, sorry. Okay, so what is the ensemble modeling approach and the Fish-MIP framework? Well, the Fish-MIP, for the people who don't know what it is, it's the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project. It's an international initiative. It's growing still. And it brings together regional and global marine ecosystem modelers so that we are, to project marine ecosystem responses to climate change on the global scale. And then we have a lot of smaller regional models where also Tyler's more involved than I have been so far. So why is a model intercomparison project necessary or needed? Let's say needed at the moment. Well, there are multiple reasons. As we know, climate change is already affecting, but it's also projected to continue to affect marine ecosystems throughout the 21st century. For example, warming temperatures. I don't know if you could see this. Yes, oh, great. So we have warming temperatures, ocean acidification, increasing extreme events, but also ocean deoxygenation, and ecosystem and species, they're responding to those changes in different ways and on different scales. So for example, there's loss of habitat, for example, due to loss of sea ice. Species are changing their ranges as we are seeing the changes in production, and also due to ocean acidification, certain shell-building organisms are also affected. And some studies also indicate that there are some size reductions or expected size reductions in certain species. So all these responses, they also affect fisheries and the wider socio-ecological system. So in terms of fishing yields and fishing costs. So this is why also a MIP is important, not just to understand what's happening in the oceans, but what are the potential effects or implications for fishery systems and so on. Okay, so, sorry. So we can assess those impacts by applying this ensemble model approach, which are usually part of these model intercomparison projects. And CMIP is one of the older, or the oldest ones as far as I know. And that's a coordinated project that projects physical and biochemical properties in the atmosphere, but also, or in the earth, but also the ocean. So for example, here we see, this is for SST, the sea surface temperature, individual projections, and then the lower panel is then the ensemble projections. So we can see the mean change, but also the variability around those mean changes. So using this ensemble approach, but also the intercomparison projects, they are becoming the gold standard in climate science. And for the ocean, Fish-MIP has just fairly recently been developed. We are in the second iteration at the moment, so a lot of what I will show you is forced by the CMIP 5, but we are now moving on into the next generation as well, and I'm going to show you some of the new stuff that's just been published as well. But essentially, such an MIP for the ocean can help to improve the capacity to convey the limitation of those models, but also the limitation of any advice we want to give about the future state of marine ecosystems and fisheries. So I just want to go a bit through the steps and how I worked through the data and how I projected, how I analyzed the data, and then go into the results a bit more. So in my PhD, I used models, 6 global marine ecosystem models that were forced by 2 Earth system models, GFDL and IPSL, from the CMIP 5. And they were forced by a standardized input, so that we can actually sort of compare and those models or combine them into an ensemble. I looked into 4 different emission scenario or representative concentration pathways. And what is important, that I only looked under climate change. So I did isolate the climate signal on those ecosystem responses and did not consider any effects of fishing, because it's still very difficult to model that. We're still trying to figure that out, especially on a global scale. So I combined those individual model projections into ensemble mean, and I used a model democracy. So that means all the models that I included in the mean or an ensemble were weighted equally. And some of the outputs I looked at was total marine animal biomass and biomass of different size classes, size ranges. And I explored, well, the mean relative changes over time, but also over space. And it's usually the mean percent relative change to the mean relative to the 1990s. And this was our historical reference period. And that would be the historical period I will talk about, or the relative change will all be relative to the 1990s in the next couple of slides. And then to look a bit into how those models perform, or the variability around those means, we looked into intermodal standard deviation and the model agreement, which I personally like because it's a quite simple metric. It just shows how many models within the ensemble are actually showing the same direction of change. So are they all increasing or are they all decreasing? And we considered about 80 to 100% a high agreement. Okay. So with this, coming more into the more specific results, a lot of them of my PhD, as I said, and all of this would have not been possible with a lot of help from amazing colleagues. So I do want to acknowledge that. And here we synthesized the global Fish-MIP models and compare projections of total animal biomass on a global scale. And as I said, I will go into the first iteration of Fish-MIP, so the CMIP 5 projections, but also show you some of the newer stuff with the CMIP 6. So this is an ensemble projections of total biomass change relative to the 1990s for all the 4 emission scenarios. And this highlights that biomass will decline under all future emission scenarios throughout the 21st century. So mostly this is due to warming temperatures and declining primary production, as these are the two variables that have the largest impact as far as we have assessed on the ensemble or on the different models. And this is then just broken up in all the different individual models, and you can see so that it's quite a range, which is good because they all have different assumptions of the ecosystem. So what we hope also here that we can include different aspects, different dynamics into the projections to maybe get a more complete picture of those changes. All right, so this is hot off the press, published last week. So we compared the same global ensemble for CMIP 5 and CMIP 6. And overall, the trend doesn't really change, so the message doesn't change. So there's still projection biomass declines projected on average globally. However, the projections with the next generation, the CMIP 6 projections, they suggest that the average global biomass will decline more steeply until the end of the 21st century. And then there's also a greater separation between those two scenarios, RCP 2.6 and 8.5, also highlighting the benefit of moving too much more climate emissions mitigations. On a spatial scale, not all ocean regions respond similar to climate warming, so it's quite variable. So we see strong increases in biomass in the polar regions, but also widespread declines in temperate and also tropical regions. And all those, I forgot to mention that we also looked at the RCP 2.6 also spatially, but in general, all those patterns are just less pronounced, but in general, they're quite the same spatially. Looking at the CMIP 6, they just revealed some kind of spatial reshuffling in the animal biomass change. But overall, again, the message stays the same around the tropics and also the temperate regions, more or less. But in the polar regions, it is a more pronounced increase, especially in the Arctic. And here, and I will go into that a bit more in my following slides, what might be happening in the Arctic, because that's also just the area I'm more and more interested in. So coming to the model agreement, so this is where we're looking into how many models are agreeing in the direction of change. And actually, I just show immediately both of them because there's actually not a big difference between those CMIP 6 and CMIP 5 forcings. But overall, there are areas, especially around the temperate and some areas in the tropics, that have high agreement in the projections. In the polar oceans, not that much. And there are several reasons. Some of them is that data availability in the Arctic is just not that high, but also the Earth system models, they're not really capturing the complex processes in both in the Antarctic region and the Arctic regions as well. But overall, even though there are regions that are not very high in their agreement, I want to focus on the regions that have a higher agreement. So I think they can provide some confidence that those ensemble model approaches can have a benefit and can help us to understand a bit more what might happen in marine ecosystems under climate change. Okay, moving from global to more regional patterns across ocean basins. Again, this is based on the Fish-MIP ensemble. And this was actually one of the first studies that I'm going to show that kickstarted the model intercomparison of within Fish-MIP. And so, but why, apart from that, why is it important to look at that scale? Why do we want to know what happens in the across ocean basins. Well, all those, climate change is affecting the oceanography, but also biological dynamics at multiple temporal and spatial scales. And the rates are also different depending on where we are. And they're expected to differ between ocean basins. So what I wanted to know here that how might those changes actually play out among ocean basins over the 21st century? So this is one of the key figures. It's again projections under RCP 8.5. With the first iteration of Fish-MIP, the red line is projected changes of total animal biomass. Green one is net primal reduction, and black is sea surface temperature. So overall, in most of the basins, biomass does decrease by in between 15 to 30% in the North and South Atlantic and Pacific, as well as the Indian Ocean, throughout until 2100. And in the polar oceans, the models projected an increase between 20 to 80%, but there's also a lot of uncertainty in those areas. And those projections, they were highly correlated with changes in net primal reduction. So whenever there's an increase in the polar ocean, biomass also increased, and the opposite was in the other basins, and it was negatively correlated with sea surface temperature. And all of this looked very similar under RCP 2.6, but it was much lower magnitude, again, highlighting what we could achieve, or what we could, what we could achieve with high emission mitigation. Okay, I want to zoom into the Arctic a bit, just to explain this really high increase. Partly, I don't think we have still fully understood why the models are doing what they're doing in the polar ocean, but we have some ideas, and we are still doing some analysis on that. So this is just again the individual model projections of all the different models in the ensemble, and then stippled line is IPSL and the solid line is GFDL. I hope you can see it because it's even the resolution on my laptop is a bit low. But so the major increase in biomass in the Arctic is partly explained by the only species distribution model in the ensemble. And that model, it actually is species specific, and it focuses only on commercial fish and invertebrates. In comparison to the other models, they project bulk changes in marine animal biomass. So for example, across different size classes, functional or trophical groups, which are then affected by, and their dynamics are affected by changes in metabolic rates or energy transfer. So for DBM, the species distribution model in the Arctic, it just starts with a really, really low initial biomass, and then species move in because of warming waters, and then that increases that results into large proportional change in biomass compared to the other models. So the other models just have a higher initial biomass because they're including all kinds of stuff already instead of just the commercial species. So that's one of the explanations. We looked into it a bit further, so we wanted to understand how the Earth system models and marine models are contributing to the variability we're seeing. So we looked into whether Earth system models on the left panel, how much are they contributing to the variability, and how much are the marine ecosystem models on the right panel. And again, the Arctic is the obvious outlier, but it is mostly due to the marine ecosystem models that there's such a high variability. But again, the Earth system models, because they have the disadvantage to still need to be improved a lot in the Arctic, they're also contributing quite a lot to the variability. Okay, so moving a bit closer to the climate change impacts and some management implications on the Canadian oceans. And here I'm going to actually pull out some results from 3 different studies. Some of them are published already, some of them are actually I'm still working on it. And the first one will look into the entire Canadian EEZ, or National Waters of Canada. And the second one is going to go into the NAFO regulatory area and climate change projections. And then the last one is about conservation efforts in the same area. Okay, so here I zoomed in with the Fish-MIP ensemble again, and I was interested in what are the general patterns, spatially in the Canadian EEZ. And both again for RCP 8.5 and 2.6, but I'm just going to focus on 8.5 today again. And while the Arctic is fairly blue, especially in the Arctic archipelago, so that indicates an expected increase in biomass. But both in the Canadian Pacific and the Arctic, it's mostly decreases by the end of the 21st century. And again, all those changes are dampened under RCP 2.6. But those results, especially because we're using global models to look a bit more regionally, they really need to be interpreted in the context of the variability and also model agreement, but also just keep in mind that these are not regional models, they're quite coarse in coastal areas and also especially in the Arctic archipelago. So the variability colors are very different here. Well, as probably expected, the highest variability was found in the Arctic, especially in the Arctic archipelago. And that was also due to that actually only 2 models within the ensemble were able to give us projections within this archipelago. So essentially the ensemble only consists of 2 models in those cells. So that affects, of course, the results a lot. Well, the agreement, though, in the Arctic and the Pacific among those models were much higher, or within the ensemble were much higher. Oh, sorry, the variation. Here we look into the model agreement. So I need to make it a bit bigger here. Well, it is quite related to this the variability, but again, the direction of the agreement in the Canadian Atlantic is actually surprisingly high. And as expected, also because what I just mentioned in the Arctic, it's quite low. But then again, I think it was still a good study to do because it highlights I guess the areas where we still need to improve those models, both the Earth system models, but also the marine ecosystem models. And I think it can also start a conversation about what kind of ocean we actually want in the future in Canada. Okay, from this broader picture, moving to the NAFO area, or the Northwest Atlantic. Here, we were interested in how projected changes in harvestable biomass may affect fisheries production. So we used the Fish-MIP ensemble to project biomass larger of 10 centimeters, and we used this as a proxy of harvestable biomass instead of the total biomass, what I used before. And spatially, by the 2090s, most of the NAFO convention area below the 60 degrees north, they showed a substantial decline in biomass and then increases of biomass the further north we go. And then we were interested in analyzing the relationship between historical fisheries landings and those projected changes within each of those areas. And so here we essentially just want to see what are the potential consequences for fisheries production under the different climate change scenarios. So blue is RCP 2.6, red again is RCP 8.5. And overall, we did find a strong relationship between those areas of projected future declines in harvestable biomass here and historical important fishing grounds. So this is like the three divisions mostly here. While areas with historically less fisheries, they're projected less, sorry, I can't really see my pointer. Well, the further north, the areas which are historically less important for fisheries so far, or commercial fisheries, say that, they are projected to experience increases in biomass or in catches indirectly. Right. So this is something I just finished this week, same area, but this is the CMIP 6, so this is the newest iteration. And here I'm looking into the biomass changes, but in context of marine biodiversity conservation under climate change. So I'm interested in assessing where we might see the most and the least ecosystem changes. So that would be hotspot of either increase or decrease, or cold spot. That's so far the name we're using for increases or decreases. And so essentially where we can anticipate the largest changes in relation to existing marine protected areas or MPAs, OECMs, which are other ecological conservation measures, I think. I always forget what it stands for. Essentially, these are marine refuges or fisheries closures. And also what are the potential changes in areas of interest. So these are the planned marine protected areas that are not designated as of now. So it's a very preliminary map, but it's the most interesting thing I find by now is that actually none of the major OECMs, so that's the black outlines, and also most of the MPAs, they are not lying in any of the hotspots I've identified. So I still need to do more analysis to see if I can maybe interpret it in some ways that can help management or conservation planning. But essentially, the plan is to have to maybe make some recommendations on how to future-proof or plan for changes within the Canadian conservation network. Okay, so this, I just want to highlight some of the impacts we've had with Fish-MIP, which are noteworthy. I think Tyler already brought them up yesterday. I think that is one of the main reasons that keeps me going with Fish-MIP, and also keeps me going in the research that I'm doing, is that Fish-MIP has been taken up in the IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere, and also the latest CMIP 6 projections, or this paper that was just published. It is was submitted for the next IPCC report. It was also the last one, the last Fish-MIP iteration, or some of the results were taken up in the IPBES report. And these are all essential documents that are important for policy development on a global scale, I'd say. Another very new news is that in collaboration with DFO and Ocean, the OFI, based on just the conservation effort study, but also in a workshop we've had, we've all made a roadmap to actually future-proof the marine conservation network for Canada, and we just sent a mandate letter to the very new DFO minister to hope that this is going to be, some of the recommendations are going to be taken up in their mandate, and hopefully they're going to make some changes in the Oceans Act. So that's, for me, that's the first, that some of the research is actually being pushed towards policy change, and it's very satisfying, and it definitely keeps me going. Okay, so with this, I'm moving to the now. As most of you know, I just started my postdoc, where we'll be looking into the changing North Water ecosystem. And I just want to give a brief overview of what my plan is, but also talk a bit about the area and why it's important, and why I'm interested in doing what I'm doing. Well, in general, the two main aims, I want to do a scoping review of available marine ecosystem models for that area, or data limited marine ecosystems in general. Because what I just all showed in the Arctic, right, all these models are pretty coarse. They're not capturing a lot of the the dynamics that are essential for these ecosystems. So I think this is a good reason to start developing warmer models for the Arctic. And that's the second goal. So to develop a model and to assess the responses of the North Water Polynya populations and communities to fishing and climate change. But to take a step back, so I just want to reiterate, because sometimes I forget, but the Arctic Ocean is one of the most vulnerable regions to global warming. And as last time I checked, it's warming twice the global average, air temperature wise, but all these changes there translating into also the marine ecosystems. There are already visible changes in seasonal sea ice and stratification that all affects the productivity, and that translate also into food web changes. So this links back to why it's good and interesting to develop marine ecosystem models for an Arctic region. But there are also these wider consequences that are expected in the Arctic. They vary a lot regionally across the Arctic, and I chose to look into the North Water Polynya. So what is a polynya? That question was asked yesterday, and I tried to give a good answer. Well, it's a year-round open water area surrounded by heavier, thicker sea ice cover. And they're considered as marine oases because they're nutrient-rich and they provide essential places or essential region for feeding, mating, and overwintering for a lot of species. And there are quite a lot of them in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, and here that's the Polynya. And the North Water Polynya is actually the Arctic's largest polynya. And it's one of the planet's most productive ocean ecosystems because partly it supports an early large plankton bloom in April that helps sustain Arctic cod, which is this little fellow, I think, which is a keystone species in the Polynya ecosystem. Because it has this high productivity and it's open, it's also in general an important area of high Arctic biodiversity. It's important for migration of a lot of mammals. And it's an important area for local Inuit communities, both in Nunavut and also Western Greenland. And it sustains Inuit with food and resources, and it's also invaluable for cultural and spiritual well-being. Other reasons that's more, sorry to have some coffee. Other reasons why I'm interested in the Polynya is that it's already rapidly changing due to both climatic and societal changes. Some studies, they already see that the Polynya is becoming less stable, and there's a lot of voices out there that expect that it will definitely become less stable with continuing climate change. So that means there's a higher accessibility, and that means that there possibly will be increasing shipping, fishing, tourism, and mining, so impacting the entire ecosystem and the wider socio-ecological system as well. And all of this all linked to larger climate shifts in the entire Arctic, and the larger consequences are also, as I mentioned, they're not really known and needs to be assessed in one way or another. Well, because of all this, actually in 2016, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, they actually established the Pikialasorsuaq Commission. Pikialasorsuaq is actually the Greenlandic name for the North Water Polynya. It means the Great Upwelling. And they recommended an Inuit strategy for actually safeguarding and monitoring the health of that ecosystem into the future. And a year later, they recommended a protected area that includes the Polynya and a wider management zone. So knowing all this, I was interested in actually combining everything I've done with climate change impacts on marine ecosystems, but also I'm interested in the Arctic, and then combine it with fisheries management, but also marine conservation management. And I hope that the work can inform the process eventually, depending on how fast I work, this whole process of developing a larger management zone. So what are the steps I'm doing at the moment, but also I will be hopefully doing. So at the moment, I'm writing a lot of emails, talking to a lot of people, trying to establish partnerships, collaborations. And I'm starting to develop this information base for the region. So what kind of data sets, what kind of knowledge systems can I use to inform my ecosystems, and what is actually the ecosystem structure and function of the North Water Polynya. And all this will then hopefully inform or help me to decide what kind of marine ecosystem model I'll eventually use. I still need to find that, so identify. So I'm looking into EcoPath at the moment. There's quite a community in Canada in the Arctic that are working with EcoPath in the Arctic, but there are a lot of other options, depending what is most adequate, I guess, for the questions I want to ask and answer. And in the end, that's the main goal. Then the main step is to assess those responses to future climate change and fisheries. And with this, I want to say thank you for being here.